Think of your favorite rock band from the last 10 years. Their success might not have been possible if not for the Strokes.
I just wanted to be one of the Strokes. Now look at the mess you made me make.
The Strokes changed the sound of popular and independent music by embodying a nostalgic sound at a time when nu metal reigned supreme and music fans were questioning rock's authenticity. Alongside the White Stripes, they led a new rock revolution. Their 2001 debut, Is This It?, was a decade-defining record that introduced the template for a new era of guitar-based music. A movement that spawned a slew of rock bands which would evolve into the alternative and indie rock scene. If they didn't influence your favorite rock band, they definitely opened the door for them to achieve some level of fame. Inspiring a renewed faith in rock music, their rise gave record companies, magazines, and radio programmers the confidence to cover a new wave of rock artists. 4 albums later, and not much else from their catalog has really come close to recapturing the immediacy of Is This It? There are some great tracks in their later releases, and the group developed into fine musicians, but their debut currently remains their most celebrated effort. We're now approaching 6 years since the group's last studio album, and with the recent news of the Strokes plotting a global comeback for 2019, 20 years since their formation, I don't know if I should be excited or not. The Strokes have had a fairly odd and inconsistent career. They're plagued to always be measured against their debut, but for a brief moment, they really did burn very brightly, leaving me and plenty of others to ask, was that really it?
Hello, the Strokes! Oh, sorry.
New York rock in the 21st century began with the Strokes, and due to the hype surrounding their debut, you would have thought they were either the best or the worst thing that could have happened. But let's back up a bit. Frontman Julian Casablancas is the core of this group. He met bassist Nikolai Fraiture while in school in New York. He met guitarist Albert Hammond Jr. at a boarding school in Switzerland. When Casablancas moved back to New York, he met guitarist Nick Valenci and drummer Fabrizio Moretti. When Hammond arrived in New York in 1998, the group locked themselves away in a rehearsal studio, and the Strokes came out the other end 6 months later. When they started playing small gigs, one of the club's booking agents became their manager and began sending off their demo to labels. It reached the ears of Jeff Travis at Rough Trade in the UK, and he agreed to sign the group, publishing their 3-track EP, The Modern Age. It sent a ripple throughout the industry and started a massive bidding war between labels in the US. The Strokes checked off all the boxes. They had the look, the sound, the attitude, the whole package. Music media were going nuts for them before the public even had a chance to hear their music. In typical fashion, Enemy's overexcitement led to the Strokes appearing on their magazine's front cover before they even had an album out. The Strokes hated the extensive publicity.
The problem is that I think the music is good enough that when you just hear it, it'll say a lot. And then like all the questions afterwards will be interesting, and all questions now are not. People watching this, they don't know who we are. They don't know what our music sounds like. So why the f are we being interviewed? Because of shit that we didn't control. And it's like, I want to see what the album says to people first.
They felt everything but their music was the focal point, and that the press inflated the notion that they were rock's saving grace. But then again, if the music wasn't so interesting, no one would have cared. And of course, hype is always met with criticism, and there were no lack of objections. Some disliked that these were private school kids, and even hated that they were just good-looking men. But their biggest critique by far were that they looked and sounded unoriginal. From what they wore to what they played, the Strokes seemed too familiar to garage rock's past. The Strokes weren't anything new, but by then nothing in rock really was. Most groups take bits and pieces from the bands and musicians they love and make it their own. And the Strokes did just that when they headed into studio to begin recording their debut record. The recording process was met with a few hurdles of its own. Their initial studio sessions with Pixie producer Gil Norton were entirely scrapped. The band felt the album was sounding too pretentious and clean. They wound up re-recording with an unknown producer months later. Casablancas would make up the lyrics on the spot and insisted that most songs only be recorded once in order to retain that raw live sound. And when their label RCA heard the first few cuts, they believed their new producer was ruining their chances of a career. It sounded fuzzy, underproduced, and Casablancas' voice was buried in the mix. Exactly how the band envisioned it. The album was released across the globe over the span of 3 months. Australia got it first in July, the UK in August, and the US was meant to see its release in September, but that's where they hit yet another snag. The group thought the track New York City Cops would be a little insensitive following the events of 9/11, and switched it out for a new song. Then the album cover was deemed too risque to be sold in US shops. But Casablancas already had a different cover in mind, an image of a subatomic particles tracks in a bubble chamber, and they opted for the alternative cover before finally releasing in the US in October of 2001. And despite all of that, Is This It was a massive success. The album lived up to expectations, it saw rave reviews from even the harshest of critics, it sat atop many end-of-year lists and would go on to sell millions of copies. Today, it's considered one of the greatest albums of the 21st century, a certified classic marking a turning point in the history of rock, making Is This It a tough act to follow.
Well, you mentioned the old album there. Is That It? It's coming out in September, isn't it?
Yes.
Is this it? Is that actually?
Is that it?
Exactly.
Is that it?
That's
Yeah.
actually Is This It?
Is that your ethos to all of this?
Room on Fire continued the sound they had established on their debut, but it was no longer as refreshing when held up against Is This It? As a result, their sophomore was fairly underrated, and Casablancas went into isolation, battling with alcoholism and cigarette addiction. This dark period was reflected in the group's third LP, First Impressions of Earth. It was a slight departure, but it was inconsistent, depressing, and fairly uninspiring, and by this time, we had the Arctic Monkeys, the Killers, Franz Ferdinand, and Arcade Fire with arguably more exciting releases. Disappointed, the group took a nearly 6-year hiatus. They tried to reconvene, but no one could settle on what the Strokes should have sounded like at this time. Casablancas would release his own solo record before getting the Strokes back together for Angles. And by then, the group's members refused to be in the same room as one another. Casablancas stepped back and was apparently absent for a good part of the writing process, literally mailing his parts in. The album was a little more colorful and it explored some fun ideas, but again, it felt fragmented. And their most recent album, Come Down Machine, might have been easy to miss. They did no promotion leading up to its release, and there was no consequent tour to support it. The album is widely regarded as a contractual obligation record, since it was the final record in their 5-record contract with RCA. It wasn't made by choice, but rather that they had to deliver an album. But there are some highlights to be found. The Strokes have yet to put out a bad album. The problem is context. Everything they release will always be compared to their debut. The hype and caliber of Is This It only led to expectations that couldn't possibly continue to be met. And that might have led to their collapse, and they were soon eclipsed by the very bands they culturally created. There is something to be said about bands that have the power to change the musical landscape for what is currently popular. The Strokes reminded everyone that sometimes not sounding like everything else at the moment can be a great thing. I think their importance to music history has more to do with their timing than whatever influence they might have had on a musical level. It was just the right album at the right time. They offered a refreshing new wave of garage rock with a pop edge, tightly packaged into 35 minutes. There was rock music before Is This It, and rock music after. Here I am, listening to it 20 years after its release, and I'm sure we'll still be listening for 20 more. That's the distinguishing factor of this album. It sounds like it's out of time, like a band from the past that took a time trip into the future to make their record. It displayed that albums didn't have to sound perfect to be perfect. I'm not ready to write the Strokes off just yet. Casablancas is also the frontman of The Voids, who released one of the best and more colorful rock albums of 2018. The group's guitarist, Albert Hammond Jr., also released his 4th solo effort last year, and probably his best work to date. If there was ever a time for the Strokes to deliver, this is it.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Funny enough, members of the Strokes were still taking music lessons while crafting their debut, showcasing that it's really never too late to tighten up your skills, and Skillshare can help you do just that. The online learning community has over 20,000 classes on things from vocal training, guitar lessons, digital production, and whatever else you might be interested in learning. A premium membership starts at about $10 a month, giving you unlimited access to all courses, but the first 500 people to use the link in the description will get 2 months of Skillshare Premium for free, giving you plenty of time to start your own rock revolution. Thanks for watching, ladies and gents. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like rating, subscribe to learn more about the music you love, and don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss an episode. If you can support the channel, head over to our Patreon page for some rewards. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at The Middle Ocho, and that's it for me. Again, thanks for watching, and keep listening.